It's Quigley, Quigley, you're up next from the Citywide Drugs Crisis Campaign.
Thank you, Oireachtas, and thank you to the members of the committee for the opportunity to come in and talk to you. Citywide Drugs Crisis Campaign is a network of community organisations that are tackling the drugs crisis on the ground in our most disadvantaged communities, and we do represent the community sector on the national structures of the National Drug Strategy. And I'm just going to make some brief comments today on the impact of gangland crime on those communities. And I'm going to talk under two headings. One, the impact on the community in general, and the other, then more specifically, the impact on young people in those communities. So starting with the community in general, and again I'm going to talk under two headings. One is low-level intimidation, and the other is the more serious violence around drug-related debt. But they're both equally important. Low-level intimidation. People will remember 20 years ago when we first began to see activities relating to the drug markets in our communities, that the communities themselves responded, communities themselves took action, they took to the streets, they marched on drug dealers' homes, so there was a community response to say, we're not putting up with this drug trade in our communities. That doesn't happen anymore, and people often comment about that. It doesn't happen now because of the levels of violence that are associated with the drugs trade. And it's not, most people in a community don't have direct experience of the violence. They aren't direct victims of the violence themselves, but the threat is implicit. It's a case of you don't cross people because you know what they can do. And this has an effect. People describe it as it's that situation where you keep your eyes down, you don't look around you, you mind your own business, you keep your mouth shut. And it's almost impossible to describe the kind of corrosive and negative effect that has in communities, because that's day after day after day. And in these communities, the kind of community bonds, the community links, people's support for each other is what has helped people to survive. And now that is being really seriously undermined by this low level of intimidation. And that again means that the communities are more open to the activities of the drugs trade and all that goes with it. And it is important to say that that kind of low-level intimidation, it'll never show up in Garda statistics because it's not incidents happening. It's that level of fear. Again, as you know, somebody said to me, it only needs one shooting in an area for 30, 40 people to be silenced. And that's how it works. So that's the low-level intimidation. And I'd say really important, do not underestimate the impact of that and how over time, how corrosive it is. Secondly, then, the more serious, I suppose, violence that's related to drug debt. Again, it's the levels of violence. It can be anything. It can be horrific, but anything up to death, which obviously is the ultimate. There's no sense of proportion around it. The actual debt itself can be very small. It can be €100, a couple of €100. So it's not even so much about the amount of money. It's the principle kind of saying you must pay us back. Obviously, there's the impact on families, that it's not just the drug user who owes the money who's held responsible. Their families and their wider circle can also be subject to the violence and intimidation. And something we've heard about recently, actually, which is horrifying for the people in those situations. There are quite a number of suicides by young people in particular around debts that they owe, and we hear of cases now where after the person has committed suicide, the debt lives on, so their family are told you're inheriting the debt. So obviously that's kind of a fairly horrific situation for those families. Specifically then in terms of young people. Again, I suppose we're looking at young people now growing up in communities where the activities of the drug trade have become normalised. And to those young people, they're looking out their own windows and look at what's happening on the street, and they don't see that the people involved in this trade are being sanctioned. And it is also important to note, I suppose, that because of that normalisation, that the drug trade has become part of our local economies. And young people are making what, from their point of view, are rational economic decisions. They're in families where the incomes are very low. Their own opportunities to earn money are very limited. And in a very short space of time, an hour, you can earn €100 by getting involved in some way, with doing some work around the drugs trade. So for a young person, that's a very appealing sort of economic opportunity. Again, there's been research done in Limerick, in Dublin as well, looking at how young people become involved kind of in the gangs and in intimidatory activities. And it is very clear, and it's very obvious, which is part of the frustrating thing. You can see it happening, that young people can start at quite a young age involved in just minor activities, carrying stuff and being messengers and scouts, but very quickly can work their way up into more serious intimidatory activities. And as Dermot mentioned, obviously the intervention at the earliest possible level there is really important. I mean, I think it is really, really important that we have practical initiatives, responses now to this, because it's breaking the cycle. Because seriously, people out there in communities there's a sense of utter hopelessness, and we can do nothing about this, and we cannot stand up to these people. And it's extremely important, no matter how difficult it is, that we do have initiatives. There are a number of things. There are the community policing forums on the ground, which are hugely important. There are operations which happen, major operations to tackle drug dealing which happen. The operations are extremely important, because it is important, particularly for young people, that they see there is a response from the police and the state. But we emphasise all the time, it can't be a choice between all the resources go into an operation and then there's no more policing for weeks afterwards. That doesn't work. If you have an operation afterwards, you must back it up with day-to-day community policing, or else it just reverts really quickly. And we need both together. There is the Family Support Network around drugs have established, in cooperation with the guards, they've set up an intimidation reporting helpline, where in every Garda station in the country there is a named person who has responsibility for that, and that guard is assigned to taking calls from families who are dealing with intimidation. That is important. In terms of, again, this breaking the silence, Citywide, we're involved with the Health Research Board at the moment in doing a piece of work which is around trying to audit the extent and levels of violence, again, or intimidation, I should say, again, because of the nature of it, it's extremely difficult to put any kind of figures on it. But for policy reasons and to have it taken seriously as an issue, we need to try and gather the data, and no matter how difficult it might be. And I suppose, just backing up what Dermot said there, youth interventions are crucially important. I mean, crucially. We know a lot of youth services that are working with young people that are literally now facing the prospect, well, will I get involved with the youth service and the alternatives they have to offer? Will I go out on the road and earn €200 doing a message for a drug dealer? That is the choice they're facing, and it is really, really hard to direct them in the way we'd want them to go. Youth services are crucially important, have been hit by really, really significant cutbacks, which is making their work nearly impossible to do. Community services, again, I can't emphasise enough, and I'm afraid people in bureaucracies do not understand the importance of local community development projects. They don't get it. They look and they see, well, what service are you delivering? They do not understand how important it is that in the local community that people have that opportunity for support, so they can literally maintain that sense of a right to stand up in their own community, a right to say this is not acceptable, a right to say we shouldn't have to live like this, a right to say I shouldn't have people behaving like that in my own area. So again, all those community supports have been devastated. And the final thing to say is, while it's crucially important we have practical initiatives now, the reality is, underlying all this is poverty and disadvantage. The communities most affected are the poorest, and the people, it's from those communities that the people who are carrying out the intimidation and violence, that's where they come from. If we don't seriously tackle poverty and disadvantage, we will never deal with this problem. People don't like to hear that because they think it's too big an issue, but it's the truth. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.